Hey everyone, John with Hardline here. This is part 2 of the series We Live in Darwin's Universe, this time on ecology. I'm recording this mainly in response to the modern notion that nature, in the ecological sense, is somehow sacred, naturally balanced, or in some way a nice place. This notion has been growing in popularity for some time now and helps things like the extreme elements within the environmentalist movement to steam along. This video is as such on the brutality of nature and on how much work over the millennia has actually gone into turning nature, as we refer to it today, into something that we can actually inhabit. To start, I'd like to talk a little bit about theology though. The reason I'm bringing it up at all is because we often don't give much credit to how clever people actually were back in the day. When we look, for example, at ancient scientists, we find feats that make modern-day geniuses look pretty average. Take Eratosthenes, for example. This guy calculated the approximate circumference of the Earth more than 2,000 years ago by measuring the shadows of poles in different cities and using spherical geometry on the measurements. The calculation he came to was actually very close to its true circumference. With that in mind, if you read ancient books like Homer and Gilgamesh, you will find them laden with the kind of symbolism and deep conceptualizing that makes them competitive with modern masterpieces. With all said, if we take something even like the Old Testament and read it not as if it's a literal story that people thought actually happened, but instead in the way we read literature, the symbolism and metaphorical messaging almost immediately reveals why people have actually carried these stories along since not long after the beginning of writing. The story I'm going to talk about here is one shared in the big three Abrahamic religions, the story of Adam, Eve, and the garden. If you've heard of Jordan Peterson, you would know that this guy loves to talk about that story, as well as countless others in religion. He's not necessarily religious though, but sees value in the stories. In essence, it can be seen to symbolically represent the struggle of evolving consciousness, where not only does the sudden awareness and capacity for both good and evil become a central conflict, but where the world, once seen from an analytical perspective, goes from a peaceful garden to a harsh and challenging environment. In the story, humanity pre-knowledge inhabits a world they imagine to be perfect. After consuming the fruit of knowledge, though, they're thrust into a world where they're damned to toil and suffer until they return to the dust. People would be banished into a world of vicious beasts, thorns, thistles, and disease. It would only be by working the land and struggling that they would ever once again inhabit a garden of any kind. People carry messages along and spread them around because they resonate with them. The story of the fall of man resonated with people for thousands of years. Through the medieval era, and even as late as the 1900s, people almost unanimously agreed that nature was harsh, dangerous, and cruel. Adventurers stepping into the unknown of the wild were brave pioneers and thrill seekers. Quite recently, though, humanity has begun to shift from being viewed as the cure to the chaos to being viewed as an aberration on an imaginary state of tranquility. The gardens, parks, and wildlife sanctuaries that many of us frequent today are not nature, they're a product of us. They are domesticated. Anyone who has ever tended a garden or ventured far beyond the boundaries of state and national parks knows this all too well. Take a walk through a city park and you will find few thorns, a high canopy on all the trees, mowed lawns, few bugs, and no predators. Leave the park and not only will you find that the terrain is much more dangerous, but simply carving a path through the wood's thick undergrowth can be exhausting. For a quick story, when I was working on my undergraduate's degree, I would work up north in Fort McMurray, the home of Canada's oil sands, for summer jobs. What took me by surprise wasn't so much the scale of industry up there, but the state of the forests. Just on a side note, most of the forests up there are untouched, pristine, so to speak, wilderness. The industry up there takes up at most the footprint of a small city, but you enter the woods about 5 hours before you drive into the town that supports the mining operations. While these woods look peaceful and lush in aerial photography as well as carefully framed pictures taken across lakes, what I found up there was quite the opposite. Now, I've lived in British Columbia, regularly traveled to the Rockies, and have probably at this point spent a cumulative year in forests surrounding Edmonton. None of these places, though, compared to the forests in northern Alberta, and not in the way that most people would expect. In the first year I worked up there, my company lent me a truck and gave me a room in an apartment that the company owned some units in. It might sound like a lot for a new low-skill worker, but most companies up there struggle to find people at all. On my first weekend off, I decided to take the truck out of town and go explore the natural area. What I found was not so much a park, but a strange kind of hellscape. Northern Alberta is peppered with little lakes, and most of the land has never been substantially altered by humanity. The land has never been set up to drain properly, so the forest floor is mostly something we call muskeg. It's basically a shrubby swamp with trees sprouting out of it. The trees in the muskeg rarely grow taller than 7 to 10 feet, and they all look sort of sickly. When you try to walk through it, even if it hasn't rained recently, your feet sink a foot or so into the ground before being suctioned in place. The undergrowth is a thick mass of thorns and spikes of broken pine trunks, and a cloud of biting bugs that make mosquitoes look like fruit flies surrounds you everywhere you go. In northern Canada, there are places which aren't like this, but these are areas which have been altered by people. The north does have everything from parks to farms to gardens, and the local climate doesn't stop people from making the area quite habitable, however, it takes work. There are two main factors that make the muskeg nearly uninhabitable and unusable: poor drainage and low soil pH. Basically, the largest ecosystem in Canada is an acidic swamp that freezes every winter where little other than moss and bugs can thrive. There are two main actions that can fix this. First, a land manager will clear the existing forest and burn it. You can't really move earth when it's the consistency of jello, and the spindly little trees, despite not providing much actual forest, tend to make earth moving and surveying very difficult. They're just tall enough that you can't see over them or walk through them. So the first thing on a patch of land is to chop everything down and burn it. It sounds quite destructive, and it is, but it helps. Wood ash is fairly basic, and letting it stay on the ground will raise the soil pH. Next is to dig drainage canals into ponds. Not a lot can grow in a marsh, and dead plants rotting in water lowers the pH further. So to keep the pH high enough that anything can grow, the water needs to drain into a lake or pond or other body of water. Once you have firm ground to stand on and neutral enough soil, you can then actually start to plant things. There are a lot of choices: crops, trees, or a mix. Up north, even with winter temperatures reaching minus 40 Celsius, that's also minus 40 Fahrenheit to anyone in the US, crops can be grown and forests can thrive. The ground basically just needs proper drainage. Now, obviously, there are plenty of places in the world that are quite habitable naturally. The west and east coasts of North America are good examples, but much, if not most, of the world's terrain is nearly uninhabitable until people have altered it. Anything from desert to tundra. If it can exist, it will. At the micro scale, the same applies with plants, animals, and the like. For another story, just this summer while I was gardening, I actually noticed something quite insidious in the plant world. The garden has a combination of trees, shrubs, and flowers, but as with any, if it's left untended, weeds will no doubt appear. Now, there are the usual types: thistle, dandelions, etc., but there are also a type of shrub that will actually grow into a full-size bush, but how it does it took me by surprise. I noticed one day in the garden that a flowering bush seemed to be covered by and dying because of a shrub that seemed to have appeared on top of it. On close inspection, I noticed that it was a type of climbing vine with thin stems and broad leaves. What it had done was climbed up the base of the flowering bush inside it and used it as support. Once it got to the top, it fanned out and covered the whole thing in its own leaves, both using it as a support structure and blocking its light. When I discovered it, my flowering bush was almost entirely dead and seemingly replaced with a whole nother plant. As I removed the weed shrub from the bush, I found that its stems, something that would usually take a lot of nutrition to build, were as thin as spaghetti, and the plant was essentially only able to exist as a predator. By the time I got out, I found that more than 2/3 of my original plant was still alive. Taking care of it, it's since come completely back to life, but through the experience I realized that even plants are fiercely competitive, if not outright predatory. When we look to the more wild parts of the world than even Canada, namely those which have most recently been exposed to technological civilization, we find a plethora of obscure and deadly creatures. Taking into consideration places like the Amazon rainforest and the Australian outback, we can see that nature is as cruel as it appears beautiful. In the Amazon, for example, there are as many poisonous and predatory animals as there are species in total in North America. And in Australia, we find the highest percentage of potentially deadly creatures of any continent. Now, why is this important? Mainly, it's because at the end of the day, romanticizing nature fundamentally undermines both reason and humanity. A person who's raised to believe that their species is some kind of an assault on a natural ideal learns to resent knowledge, their people, and society. Take an extreme example, the Unabomber. I was assigned in a course a few years ago to read his manifesto. In reading it, two things were apparent. A, he was delusional, and B, despite it, he was clearly very smart. Where he went wrong was in believing that primitive life was easier, more peaceful, and more humane than life in civilization. The cure in his eyes was to violently lash out against technology. Now, I don't expect most people to be at risk of going down this path, but buying into the idea that nature is the higher ideal to people, rather than the other way around, shares his same foundation. Nature does indeed provide good things. We get clean air from forests, and many of the Amazon's venoms have medicinal uses. But for the most part, we like nature because we associate it with fertility. A green forest with abundant ecological diversity cues the same subconscious signals that tell us there might be food there, or that its soil might be good for crops. Perhaps, though, one of the best modern purposes for true wilderness is to remind us of where we came from, and what a world without people would be like, as well as how much people bring to its table. I'll close there. This has been part 2 of the Darwin series. Part 3 will likely be the last installment, and it will be on organizational structures and corporations. As always, more videos are on the way, and in the meantime, thanks for watching.